Posts are due by the end of the day today for your initial post on that group discussion board, so make sure you go check that out before this evening. And then after the weekend, we'll have peer responses due by next Monday night. Like we were chatting about, pre-work should be done for before lab today, but there'll be that hour in between lecture and lab for you to work on it. And hopefully any questions that have popped up for you, we can make sure we address during class. Just reminding us of our learning outcomes. We're kind of focusing on these bottom three today. I'm going to kind of review some of the confounding variables ideas and then really start to talk about different types of experiments and how we design them. Just to kind of bring this all together and thinking about how we do this and why, a lot of what we're trying to do with any experiment is really looking at that relationship between variables or among treatments, or determine if multiple groups are different, right? We're trying to really statistically isolate the observations that we see in a data set that we collect, you know, by observing nature, by observing process, by observing whatever it is, and then isolating some of those variables like we did in that soil health experiment on the paper. You know, that was an observational study where they were looking at a lot of different factors. Then the experimental design component is really trying to narrow in and test some of these factors. The idea really is that we're trying to minimize this whole number two here, minimize these confounding variables. And some of the texts will call these lurking variables. Some of them will call them kind of just, connected or confounding issues. The idea is really to keep all of those confounding variables that you can think of the same, such that when you're testing for your one response, or I'm sorry, when your one independent variable that is of interest, you understand that yes, that effect was indeed from that variable, rather than potentially one of these these other confounding factors. I have these two things grayed out because this maximizing power is a really important topic, but one that's a little more advanced and one that we're not going to get to in this class. It's essentially what is your minimum sample size that maximizes the power based on predicted variability? And this is something, if you're really interested in, we can certainly talk about offline and maybe further in the semester if we have time. And I only grayed out number 4 is about applying these results to a wide range of situations. We're going to continue to do that throughout the class, but the idea is really like, how do you communicate? How do you make sure that the work you're doing is relevant and not just applicable to the really controlled lab setting you might have developed during your experiment? So we're not going to discuss how to do that, but that's going to come in throughout the course. And so I wanted just to make sure that we talked about that a little bit, but it's not really a focus today. So how do we do this? How do we really design these things to minimize our bias? And so I just list a couple examples, and we've already talked a lot about simple random samples, and these are ones where every person, every soil sample, every plant, every whatever in that population you're sampling has an equal chance, equal probability of being selected. So that's that simple random sample. But there's other ways in which different disciplines do this. So in medicine, you've probably heard, just in your normal kind of like interactions in life, the idea of a placebo, right? So if you're trying to test the effectiveness of a new drug, you don't just give the drug to a group and then do nothing to the other group, because then they know that they didn't have it, right? So what you do is you give everyone some administered, let's just say it's a pill, so everybody gets something, and then the placebo is like a sugar pill or something that doesn't have any effect. And so not the person taking it doesn't have that, kind of placebo effect, we call it, but basically having, knowledge of the fact that they're having treatment can often affect the outcome. So that's one way in which we minimize bias. Blind experiments, I think, is often thought of as like a psychology or some other kind of human subjects research, but this is something that we do in our group when things get really complicated as well. So in a lot of different disciplines, this makes sense. So one simple way is you collect all your data and you have an ID, so you know what treatment they are. But when you go to analyze those results, you keep that there, but you code it with like a number and you randomize those numbers. So you don't know that number 1 is a treatment with an enhanced. So back to our soils experiment, you might have treatments 1 through 10, don't have compost treatments 11 through 20 do. And then you could randomize those numbers instead so that they're all jumbled up. And then when you go to analyze the data, then you use your code after the fact, if that makes sense. So you're really trying to not bias your own results by just your expectation that, for example, the compost is going to have a higher yield. So you're trying to minimize that. So that's kind of like a blind approach for just one person trying to do that. Okay, reminders of the key terms. I just wanted to bring these back because we're going to talk a little bit about factors, levels, and treatments today. Oops. Geez, sorry. My mouse is very touchy. So the first experiments we're going to talk about is this randomized experiment. And this is the explanatory variable that is each unit is determined randomly, right? And then you're measuring this response. So randomly dividing units into groups, assigning treatments, etc. But it's assuming just a simple random sample. You're not trying to do anything fancy here. And so so that's the, oh, that was in the wrong spot. I'm so sorry. Sorry, that should have been after, but point is, these are the different types of experiments we're going to talk about. So completely randomized design is what I was just talking about. We're not trying to do anything fancy in terms of creating groups or trying to test multiple factors. We're testing one factor typically, trying to minimize the effects of confounding variables in a randomized fashion. We're going to talk about randomized block design. This is very common agricultural research because we recognize that there's a lot of things that are happening in the environment that we're trying to separate out. And so you might hear these like split plot design. That's also another kind of term. But basically, we're creating groups that have known similar characteristics, but we can't completely get rid of them, all this variability. So we're trying to create some different groups and then test within those groups. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. And then factorial design is a way that you can look at multiple groups and you can diagram this really nicely with a matrix, and that's super helpful. And Danny has a really nice example of this in her own research that we're going to talk about at the end of class today. Okay, so here is this completely randomized design idea. And this is really the simplest of all of the designs. And so in this case, we're having 20 different plots in a field, let's say, and we're just trying to assess the effect of 5 different things, or creating 5 different treatments or 5 different conditions. And so the idea is, hey, we're going to go through this and we're just going to randomly assign them throughout our 20 plots. In this case, if you're looking at spatial differences and these 2 green ones are right next to each other, that could have an effect, right? You might have something where these 2 white ones now are connected to each other, and that might not be ideal. So this same treatment effect can happen. And so to correct for that, and what sometimes we can think about is creating these rows as blocks. And so now each row has one of those 5 colors, but they're randomized within that row. And so this case, this would be your block, and these different groups that are different colors are your treatments. And so this is a way to control variation and count for different spatial effects that are happening. So you're treating, you know, all of these blocks as kind of one level, and then within that block. So you're allowed to have 4 replicates similar to the previous one, but they're spaced evenly around, like, say, a field, which has a lot of variability. You want to make sure you're trying to minimize that. So I think it's easiest to see with an example. Let me look at this. So say this is your field, right? And these are different soil types. And so if you have multiple soil types throughout, and this is not uncommon, if any of you have an agricultural background, fields are very variable. Even driving around Indiana, if you just come to Purdue, you can see yellower parts of soybeans, for example, and more green parts, or you could see parts that didn't grow as tall of corn as other parts because of variations in both elevation and or soil type that cause different kinds of wetness, different kinds of organic matter to accumulate, things like that. So this is really common. You might have a field that looks like this. And this really doesn't address any of the topographic things that we were talking about with our discussion last week. So when you put this kind of block design on it, you're getting a lot of variability underlying it, but you're creating a situation where you're equally likely for the green block, for example, let's follow it, to be in multiple different types of soil. So here it's up in partially the orange and the lighter, darker yellow. Down here it's in bright yellow. Over here it's in green. This one's fully in orange. But you also might not perfectly capture it, right? So red is in this orangey color here, or the kind of dark yellow. Here it's in the green, and here it's in the dark yellow. So we did not see a situation where red got in this lighter color. So, you know, it's a situation of chance. Oftentimes these are helpful, but they're not perfect either. And so recognizing limitations of this approach is really important. I'm gonna pause here, and if you have questions about this, put them in the chat, or just raise your hand and we can unmute and discuss this, because I think this is a pretty fundamental kind of blocking design is pretty important. And Danny, if you have any additional things to share, please go ahead and do that. If everybody's super clear on it, just give me a little thumbs up or a whatever, smiley face, jazz hands, whatever floats your boat today. Okay. Awesome. All right. So hopefully this is pretty clear. Good. Great. Factorial design is a little more, a little different, but essentially what we're going to do is think about fuel additives in this example. And in this example, we're saying, hey, we want to know, does a fuel additive, something you pour into your gas tank when you fill up, does it improve your gas mileage or not? And you want to test this experimentally. So how you might draw that out is something that looks like this, okay? This is a very, very simple matrix. It's only a 2x1, right? You got a fuel additive and it's either yes or it's no. And this would be your level, right? So right here, I've kind of summarized this in the notes you pulled down, maybe don't have this in them, but the factor in this case is the additive. That is our testable treatment, what we're gonna do. So that's what we call our factor. The level is the value of that factor. And in this case, the value is simply a yes or a no. And you can code this, and when we do these kinds of things, and you actually saw this in your sleep study, oftentimes we code these as 0, 1. We don't really often always use categorical words always, or we could call this true false. So you can figure out how best to do this for your own work, but it's a yes, no. So that's a nice binary kind of response. So we can think about that in a little bit more complicated way as well. Slightly different experimental design approach or figure, right? So this is another way of drawing this out. So you select a group. Gives you a little more information, but it also is a little bit more involved, right? And so when we talk about design, I think both are particularly useful. Here, we're talking about how many samples are in our group. And so that sample size is what this is, right? Our full sample size is 100. And then we're assigning 2 groups, 50 people each, right? So we got 100 test drivers. We're giving them, randomly splitting them into 50 people. So this is an example of our SRS, our simple random sample. Each person has an equal likelihood of going to group 1 or group 2. And group 1, we're going to give them some fuel additive, and group 2, we're not. But maybe we want to do a placebo of some variety, so everybody puts something in, so they're not skewed by the knowledge of whether or not they have this fuel additive. So there's another important point about minimizing bias. And then you have them record their gas mileage, and then you compare outcomes. So in this case, we're thinking about responsive dependent variable. What is our treatment / independent variables? We can think about, you know, our response is all the way over here, gas mileage, right? Our treatment, our independent variable is whether or not we add this fuel additive or not. Okay, pretty basic. Kind of not super, hopefully this is something you've had before, but these diagrams are probably not something you've seen. Is that true? Have you guys seen these kind of diagrams before or not really? You can just give me a little heads up, thumbs up or not if you want to or not. Kind of similar? Okay. These flowcharts are really common and they're really helpful when things get complicated. All right. So let's go back to our example. Like say now that we want to notice that actually this fuel additive might be important, but that actually observational data has shown us that type also plays an important role. So what do we do now? So I'm going to give you just a few seconds to think about how you might change this to say, I have 3 different types of fuel. to look at? How might you redo this little figure? And I'm just going to give you 30 seconds to just kind of think on your own, and then I'll show it up so we don't have to waste too much time on this. And if you hear my children speaking in the background, more power to you. All right, I think I'm gonna stop. Does anyone have anything they wanna share, or should I just pop it up? I can do either one. I can't see everyone with this view. It's kind of frustrating. So I'm just gonna show this here instead. I'm sorry. I wish there was a way that I could do that differently, but alas. So what I drew here was I just now instead added another set of rows here that would allow us to look at fuel type. So now maybe we have this regular fuel type, the cheap one that most of us probably put in our vehicles, this mid-grade, maybe this is some sort of ethanol derivative or who knows, right? So there's some sort of mid-grade fuel, and then premium, which is what, you know, the fancy sports cars use, right? And so these three fuel types might be another way for you to go and create this set of matrix of different kinds of treatments. So in this case, what is your factor? Or factors, maybe I should say. Go ahead and put in chat or raise your hand or whatever works out for you. Okay, everybody put something in chat. It's not an option now. Thanks, Ariely. Fuel type and fuel additive is what she's saying. Does everybody agree with that? Few nods. If you aren't sure, the things that we've used for our factor are the different things that we're changing, the treatments, if you will, right? Or I don't want to use that word because that's another thing. So the factors are the different things that you're changing as part of your experiment. So what would you call a treatment in this case? Somebody else other than Ariely gets to post this in the chat. And if you don't, I guess I will start calling on people. Elissa said additive is a factor, or is the treatment. Close. Think of, does anyone else have an idea? I see a few cross-eyed, wrinkled brows. Think of the treatment as one of these little blocks. So that is your treatment. So the treatment in this case could be, Elissa, do you want to modify your answer? If you're so inclined.
Would it be the type of fuel with the additive?
Right. So a treatment would be regular fuel plus fuel additive, regular fuel plus no fuel additive. So each little box is a different treatment. So in this case, you have 6 different treatments. How would you define the level then? It would be that would be the value that you would kind of write in here. So in this case, I don't have a pen easy to, maybe I can. I don't know if I can do this. So in here, we'd be like, yes, and regular. It's really hard to write with those. This value would be no and regular. That looks like a K. So you get the idea, right? What about a control? What would be a control in this case, do you think? Would any of these fall into that category? Right, so thinking about control means basically what is the business as usual? What is the do nothing? What is the normal approach? So I would say in this case that this would be our control, most likely, right? So this would require some sort of understanding of regular fuel, but we can't have no fuel. That doesn't really work, right? So this is we can define this regular with no fuel additive as our baseline condition, and then all these other things are kind of variations upon that. Good. All right. Thank you for your participation a little bit. I know this is not ideal, but you know, we're doing our best we can. So now back to our experimental diagram, this gets much more complicated now, right? But still very helpful. So if you go back, we had these 6 different boxes. This is a much easier way to visualize it in some ways, right? Because you've got the 6 different treatments and they're clearly articulated in this matrix effect. And now when we do this design, it's a lot more complicated, but we have the same idea. We have 100 drivers. We're randomly assigning each group 50 people, and then we're allowing those 50 people to do 3 different things. So maybe the fuel additive people are trying 3 different types of fuel. You know, this is one way you could do this. I'm certain you could figure out multiple ways in which you could do this, right? You could do it, split those 100 people into 6 groups. You'd have, what would that would, rather than just ask questions, because it's hard to reply back. The challenge, right, is that 100 people making it into 50. Now you have 3 different groups, but you have an N of 50 for each of those boxes. If you split this into 100 and just had everybody do one thing, you'd have 100 divided by 6, or so around 15-ish. And so that would be a much smaller sample size, which would then decrease your power. And so I know we're not going to talk in depth about that, but as sample size goes up, your ability to understand variability in your population also increases, because you're starting to look at a wider range of the potential responses that population could have. So a smaller sample size is not great because you can have a lot of things changing, but as you get more and more people, you get more and more representative, a lot closer to understanding the behavior of a population. And we're going to talk a lot about this as we go, but it's an important concept that you start to internalize early. If there's questions about that, certainly pop them in the chat and we'll come back to them. Okay, I want to just kind of then summarize all of this stuff with an example. And here I'm going to have you guys, I think this is in your notes pages, right? Can someone let me know? I can escape out of this thing and look. Nah. Just check really quickly. Okay. Yeah, so this is your smartphone app. And so I want you guys to kind of go through this in your small groups. So I'm going to give you some breakout rooms to talk through this part. And so the idea here is that, if I can go back to the full screen. We're going to try to compare treatments in this example. And we're going to try to do them with the different types of experiments we've talked about, but one we haven't talked about just yet. So we're going to compare treatments and we're going to talk about them in a way that minimizes confounding factors as best as we can. So thinking about this situation, I'll give you a minute to read it. And we're going to just talk briefly about what completely randomized design means and what matched pairs means. So read through that. I'll give you a couple more seconds and then I'll kind of explain those. Okay, looks like most of you are done reading. So the idea with a completely randomized design is that you're essentially just doing what we've talked about before. Every member of the population has ability to equally be put into this group or that group. The challenge is sometimes that there is an effect of the person or the place that you can't get rid of, right? So in this case, it's a person using an app. So certain people have different affinities, different abilities, different preferences, etc., right? And so rather than assigning group 1 randomly from however many people to use app 1 and group 2 to analyze randomly app 2, what a matched pairs would say is everyone does both. And the way you would design it is maybe you say group 1 use app 1 first, and then the next week use app 2. And then group 2 is going to use app 2 first, and then use app for the first week, and then use app 1 for the second week. And the reason we might want to switch the order is that maybe just in general, an app is helpful to figuring out how to better study. And so both of them are good and they're better than doing nothing. So you want to control for that. So the matched pair in this case is an individual. Another really good example is, say you assume that in, you know, heterosexual couples that are married, the man is always older than the woman. So let's say in your match design here, you just look at 100 couples randomly found in this in the census data or something like that. They range from ages of 20 up to 100. And you look at the average age of the men and the average age of the women, and you just compare those two groups. What do you think is going to be? Are those going to be highly variable or not very much? Probably highly variable, right? As I just said, your ages are from like 100 to like 20 because there are all types of people. And so if you see these huge groups of variability, you're not going to be able to tell whether or not the man is actually older than the woman because they're just so big of a range. Instead, you can match them by the couple. And so you could say, okay, your partner and my partner, what is the difference? Okay, my partner is actually, you're younger than me. And so that would be a delta of -1. My friends down the street, they're in their 60s. There's 65 and 63. That would be a delta of +2. And then you could compare those deltas. Now, me in my 40s and them in their 60s, they don't, that variability is easier to see. And so we're going to do some examples of this using some quantification later in the semester, and it'll become a lot more clear. But that matched pairs is a really powerful tool, particularly in environmental data, in machine quality control kinds of situations, censored calibration, because the fact that things there's a lot you can't control. And so if you can figure out a way to get it into a matched pairs design, it can be a lot more powerful. Hopefully that made sense. I like the couple example often because it's a little bit more intuitive. Is that good? Are we good to keep moving? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to go ahead and put you into groups. And what you want to do for this little exercise is essentially those little experimental design charts. You can use the flowchart style. I think that's helpful, or for these particularly, but you can also use the factorial design as approach as well. And thinking about, there's not probably enough space on your notes to scribble on them, so you might want to use your own paper. But the idea here is to work together as a team of, I think I can put you in rooms about 3 or 4 to get these things sorted. And Danny and I will pop into each of the rooms and answer questions. Do you feel equipped to do this? Are we good? I can see all of your faces now, so either give me a recorded thumbs up or your actual thumbs up. Everybody's good. Perfect. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and put you in breakout rooms. We have about 15 minutes to do this.
I have a question. Are you talking about the Lab 2 handout?
No, I'm talking about example 2 in Notes Lecture 4.
Notes lecture. Thank you.
You're welcome. Is everybody clear what we're working on? It's the smartphone app, and there's 3 questions, and we'll work for about 10 minutes because I want to come back at the end of class to talk a little bit about what's next. Okay, so let's summarize briefly what we discussed during our breakout sessions was this smartphone app and the idea of the 3 different types of designs. So the first one was create an experiment that is completely random. So in that case, you would say, hey, I'm going to call the registrar's office and ask for you to send me 100 names of undergraduate students. Just randomly pull them out of the registration rolls, right? They have no understanding of major, age, demographics, any of that, just 100 random students. So each student has an equal likelihood of being selected. And then you take those 100 students from the random population and you randomly assign them to 2 groups. Group 1 will test smartphone app number 1, and group 2 will test app number 2. The next one, that's pretty basic, right? That's the same kind of experimental random design we've been talking about. The match pair is a little more challenging, and in this case, the matching is you want to match it by person. So you might find that certain students are really comfortable with an iPhone, other students are comfortable with an Android phone. Certain students just have more acumen or experience with using different kinds of apps. And so regardless, you want to make sure that you understand that variability. The other thing is that these apps might be just so great that they're better than nothing. And so they're all just so much better and their scores are all pretty high that it's really hard to tell a difference between the two. It's similar to like averaging out the ages of the couples. So in that case, what you might do is say, okay, same. I'm going to get 100 names from the registrar. I'm going to randomly assign to 2 groups of 50. And then in each of those groups of 50, I will say, okay, group 1, you're going to use app 1 first. And then app 2, you're going to score both using the same scoring rubric or score sheet. And you're going to give it an aggregate score. It might be something like 0 out of 10. And then your thing you're testing then, and we'll learn about this later on in the course, is the difference in those scores. So you're now comparing individual 1, their score from app 1 and app 2. Individual 2, score from app 1 and app 2. And you keep that delta the same so you can look at plus and minus to see which one is better. Hopefully that made sense. And that's kind of where you got to. A few groups had some questions about that, but is that kind of little nods that make sense? One thing we're going to start using, which we found while we were sitting here, if you click on the participants button at the bottom, you should see a list of everybody in the room. Yeah. And in that list, you should see a whole bunch of things at the bottom that say, yes, no, go slower, go faster, and more. So what we're going to do, Clay, thank you for the thumbs up. What we're going to start doing is if I ask questions like, what do you think? Is it yes? Is it no? Whatever. Do you get it? I want you to do a yes, no here. And then when we get more involved questions, we'll start to do a little more polls like we did that first week. It's just really hard to provide feedback to me and to each other in this large group. So let's try that for the lab session as well. Okay, and then the last one is the sophomores wanting different kind of study spaces than seniors. And this is an example of that blocking design. So what you might now instead say is, okay, registrar, I need you to give me 50 random freshmen, 50 random sophomores, 50 random juniors, 50 random seniors, or maybe just the sophomores and seniors if you're really interested in that difference. And then you do the same thing, but now you've blocked by age. So you might do a random assessment after that, or you might then tack on the matched pairs approach after that as well. So you've got your random group of 50 sophomores. You might again split them into 2 groups, app 1 and app 2, and apply that matched pairs design of doing one then the other. Or you might find whatever situation you want to just do a randomized experiment because it's faster or cheaper or something. Okay.